Picture this. It is 3 o'clock in the morning on the 28th of June, 1762. A woman slips out of the palace at Peterhof in near total darkness. She has not slept. She's wearing a black morning dress, the only clothes she could grab, without making a sound. Her heart is hammering. She is 33 years old. She is foreign-born. She speaks Russian with a trace of a German accent. She has spent 18 years desperately trying to erase, and in approximately 4 hours, if everything goes according to plan, she will be the empress of the largest country on earth. If it does not go according to plan, she will be arrested, possibly executed, almost certainly erased from history entirely. There is no army waiting for her, no official decree, no legal claim she can hold up to the light. There is only the darkness, a carriage, and a woman who has spent nearly 2 decades learning exactly how to read a room and exactly when to burn it down. This is not the story of a queen who was born to power. This is the story of a woman who looked at power, sized it up, and quietly, methodically, and without a single mistake, stole it. Find a comfortable position. Let's begin. To understand what happened on that June morning in 1762, you have to go back to a ballroom in Prussia in the winter of 1744. A 14-year-old girl named Sophia Augusta Frederica is getting dressed for the most important audition of her life. Sophia is the daughter of a minor German prince, the kind of provincial nobility that existed all across 18th century Europe, aristocratic enough to have a title, poor enough that the title was nearly all they had. She is not, by any conventional measure, a spectacular candidate for anything. Her family has no real money, no real influence, and no real future to offer her. Her mother, a sharp, socially ambitious woman named Johanna, had drilled this reality into Sophia from the time she could understand words. "You are a pretty girl," Johanna would tell her daughter, with a voice like a blade being sharpened. "Being pretty is a resource. Do not waste it." So when an invitation arrived from the Russian court, from Empress Elizabeth herself, who was looking for a bride for her nephew and heir, Johanna packed their bags before the ink was dry. Russia in 1744. Russia was the kind of country that Western Europeans regarded with a mixture of fascination and barely concealed horror. It was vast, cold, complicated, and ruled by a woman who wore diamonds to breakfast and had been known to have the tongues of her enemies cut out as a form of mild displeasure. The Russian court was a place where fortunes were made and destroyed overnight, where a single whisper in the wrong ear could mean exile to Siberia, and where everyone was constantly watching everyone else, with the particular vigilance of people who understood that survival was never guaranteed. For Johanna, this was an adventure. For Sophia, who was 14, perceptive beyond her years, and already fluent in French and German, it was something else entirely. It was a test, and she intended to pass it. The Grand Duke Peter, the man Sophia was brought to Russia to marry, was by almost every account a disaster. He was 17 when they met, thin, pale, perpetually sniffling from one illness or another, deeply obsessed with toy soldiers in a way that had long since stopped being charming and had started being alarming. He hated Russia. He idolized the Prussian King Frederick the Great with the fervor that some boys reserve for sports heroes, which would have been merely eccentric had he not also been in line to rule Russia, which was, at that very moment, at war with Prussia. He was not cruel, exactly, He was immature and careless, and fundamentally uninterested in the enormous responsibility that history had handed him. He drank too much. He made inappropriate jokes during formal occasions. He kept his Holstein soldiers, the personal guard he'd imported from his German homeland, around him at all times, like a comfort blanket made of men. When Sophia met him, she understood in approximately 5 minutes that her future husband would never be the most powerful person in any room. She filed that information away carefully, and she got to work. The work Sophia did in those early years in Russia is, in many ways, the most extraordinary part of this entire story. And it is the part that history most often skips past in its rush to get to the dramatic scenes, the coup, the dead husband, the lover galloping through the night. But those dramatic scenes are only possible because of what came first. What came first was transformation, deliberate, total, almost surgical transformation. The first thing Sophia did was learn Russian, not polite Russian, not the handful of phrases a well-bred foreign princess might pick up to please her hosts. She learned Russian the way a person learns to breathe, compulsively, obsessively, waking up before dawn to study with tutors, repeating words in her sleep, falling so deep into the language that she would eventually think in it. She was so committed that she reportedly walked the cold palace floors at night, in thin slippers, muttering vocabulary to herself, and developed a serious pneumonia that nearly killed her. When her German doctor tried to bleed her, the fashionable treatment, Sophia refused and asked for a Russian Orthodox priest instead. This was not an accident. This was theatre. Brilliant. Calculated. Theatre. The message she sent was unmistakable. This girl is not German. She is one of us. The second thing she did was convert to Russian Orthodoxy. She did it publicly. She did it with evident emotion and reverence, and she did it so convincingly that the assembled Russian clergy wept. She took a new name, Catherine, Yekaterina, and she wore it like a second skin. A new identity pulled over the old one. She married Peter in August of 1745. She was 16. That night, after the ceremony, after the banquet, after all the toasts and the pageantry and the fireworks over the Neva River, she sat alone in the bridal chamber for 3 hours. Peter had gone to bed drunk and was already asleep. She sat there in the candlelight, in her wedding dress, and she thought. She would describe this moment later in her memoirs with a kind of clear-eyed honesty that is almost unsettling. She was not heartbroken, she wrote. She was not surprised. She was planning. The years that followed were not easy years. Her relationship with Peter did not improve. It simply calcified into a comfortable mutual indifference. He had his Holstein soldiers and his mistresses. She had her books. Catherine read voraciously Montesquieu, Voltaire, the French encyclopédiste, legal philosophy, history, political theory. She read the way some people drink, compulsively and with increasing tolerance. She was educating herself for a role she could not yet name out loud. She also had her own romantic life, conducted with the careful discretion of a woman who understood that being caught meant ruin. There was Sergei Saltykov, a charming courtier widely believed to be the father of her son Paul. There was Stanisław Poniatowski, a Polish nobleman who was brilliant and besotted in equal measure. These relationships were not merely about loneliness, though she was lonely. They were also political, having allies, having men who were devoted to her and who moved in the circles she needed to influence. This was not incidental. it was architecture. All the while, she watched Empress Elizabeth age. She watched the court shift and realign. She watched Peter grow more erratic and more openly contemptuous of Russia, openly praising Frederick the Great at official dinners, while Russian soldiers were dying fighting Frederick's armies on the Eastern Front. She made no grand gestures, she raised no alarms. She was the perfect Grand Duchess, gracious, intelligent, approachable, deeply Russian, endlessly patient. She attended every church service. She learned every nobleman's name and the names of his children. She remembered their birthdays. She sent small, thoughtful gifts during illnesses. She was building something. She was building a coalition, one relationship at a time, in a court where everyone had been ignoring her for years, because she was just Peter's wife, just the German girl, just an accessory to the real story. She let them think that. She had infinite patience for being underestimated. In December of 1761, Empress Elizabeth died. Peter III became Tsar of Russia, and within 6 months, he had managed to alienate virtually everyone who mattered. He made peace with Prussia, not just peace, but a fawning, embarrassing, entirely voluntary peace that handed back all of Russia's territorial gains from 7 years of war and asked for nothing in return, simply because he personally admired Frederick the Great. The military establishment was incandescent with rage. These were men who had watched their soldiers die in those campaigns. Peter gave it all back, like a man returning a borrowed hat. He announced plans to confiscate church lands. He introduced German-style military drilling, which the Russian Guards regiments, proud, tradition-bound, and deeply suspicious of anything Prussian, found deeply humiliating. He stopped attending Orthodox services and was seen openly mocking them. He also began, publicly, and without any apparent awareness that this was dangerous, to talk about divorcing Catherine and marrying his mistress. He had Catherine briefly arrested at a state dinner and publicly humiliated in front of the entire court. This was the mistake that ended him. Not because Catherine cried. She did not cry. She sat through the humiliation with a composure so complete it seemed almost inhuman, and she quietly registered every face in the room, who looked away in embarrassment, who leaned in with delight, who met her eyes with something that looked like fury on her behalf. Those men in the last category, those were the ones she needed. The man who had become the engine of the coup was Grigory Orlov. He was 27 to a 33, a guards officer built like a cathedral, physically fearless in the way that some people simply are, as though the concept of personal danger has never quite connected in their minds. He was also charismatic in a broad, uncomplicated way that moved easily through crowds, not subtle, not strategic, but magnetic, and absolutely loyal. He and Catherine had been involved for some time. She was pregnant with his child when Peter became Tsar. But what made Orlov indispensable was not his relationship with Catherine. It was his relationship with the guards. He had 4 brothers, all guards officers, all liked, all trusted by the enlisted men in the way that officers only are when they've stood in the same mud and eaten the same terrible food. The Orlov brothers had spent years cultivating those bonds, lending money to soldiers who needed it, standing by men who got into trouble. They were beloved in the barracks, and now they began, carefully and quietly, to have certain conversations. Would you follow her? If it came to that, would you follow her? Catherine herself was working in parallel, at a different level. She met with officers and officials, one-on-one or in small groups, always somewhere private, always with that extraordinary quality she had of making people feel as though they were the most important person she'd ever spoken to. She was not making promises she could not keep. She was reminding people of things they already knew. She was not inciting them. She was articulating grievances they already had and making herself the natural solution. The conspirators were not, in the end, an enormous group. They did not need to be. They needed the guards regiments in the capital. They needed a few key officials. They needed everything to move fast enough that Peter couldn't react. Catherine wrote later that the conspiracy was always on the edge of exposure. At least 5 people had loose tongues. 1 soldier, drunk and frightened, told a superior that something was being planned. The superior, in a decision that perhaps tells us something about how broadly Peter was despised, failed to report it. By the summer of 1762, everyone knew something was coming. Even Peter knew something was coming. He simply did not take it seriously enough to act. This was the last and most fatal of his miscalculations. On the night of June 27th, one of the conspirators, a young officer named Pasek, was arrested on unrelated charges. Word spread through the network within hours. They were out of time. Catherine was at Peterhof, the summer palace outside the city. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the message reached her. Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, a man with a scar across his face and a reputation for absolute physical nerve, arrived at her rooms, woke her, and told her the soldier's bluntness. It has to be now. She dressed in the dark. She left quietly. She climbed into the carriage. What was she thinking? In that carriage, rattling through the pre-dawn darkness towards St. Petersburg. We know what she wrote about it afterward. Crisp, almost businesslike, as though recounting a piece of administrative procedure. But underneath that composure, there must have been something else. 18 years. 18 years of patience and calculation and performance. And waiting. And now the carriage was moving, and it was happening. And if she was wrong about any single link in the chain she had built, it was over. She arrived at the Izmailovsky Guards Regiment barracks at dawn. Alexei Orlov pulled her out of the carriage before it had fully stopped, and stood her in front of the assembled men. She spoke to them. We don't have a transcript of what she said, but we know the effect. Within minutes, they were on their knees, swearing allegiance, not to their Tsar, but to her. From the Izmailovsky barracks, the party moved to the Semyonovsky regiment. Same result. Then to the Preobrazhensky regiment, the oldest and most prestigious of the guards, the regiment Peter the Great himself had founded. The regiment knelt. By 7 in the morning, she was riding through the streets of St. Petersburg, and the crowds were gathering, and the shout was going up from thousands of throats, not Peter's name, but hers. She stopped at the Kazan Cathedral, where the Archbishop was waiting. He proclaimed her Empress. The church bells began to ring. It had taken, from the moment she stepped out of the carriage at the first barracks to the moment the bells rang, approximately 4 hours. Peter III, meanwhile, was at the palace of Oranienbaum, where he'd been told nothing. When news finally reached him that his wife had taken his throne, his initial response was to dismiss it. His advisors urged him to march on St. Petersburg immediately, with his Holstein troops, to retake the capital by force. He had perhaps 12 hours before the window closed. He spent those 12 hours writing letters. He offered to share power. He offered to make concessions. He offered, in one desperate dispatch and to give Catherine anything she wanted if she would simply allow him to remain nominally Tsar. She did not reply. His military commanders began, one by one, to melt away. His advisors urged retreat to Holstein, his German homeland, where he might at least be safe. He was seen crying. He was seen drinking heavily. He was seen, according to one account, playing the violin in a corner while the last of his supporters stood around him in bewildered silence. By the evening of the same day, Catherine was proclaimed empress. Peter had signed his abdication. He wrote it himself. He handed over the rings, the sword, the orders of his rank. He was allowed to keep his dog, his violin, and his personal servant. He was taken to the small palace at Ropsha, 30 miles from St. Petersburg, under light guard. A week later, he was dead. The official announcement said it was a hemorrhoidal colic. Nobody believed that, not then and not now. Alexei Orlov, this same man who had driven Catherine through the darkness that morning, was at Ropsha when it happened. He wrote Catherine a panicked, semi-coherent letter that historians have debated ever since, which seems to describe either an accidental death during a violent altercation or a killing that got out of control. Catherine never replied to the letter. She kept it, filed it away, and never referred to it publicly. She grieved publicly, in black, for 6 days. She wore her hair unpowdered. She received condolences with appropriate gravity. Then she got back to work. Now, here is where most stories about Catherine the Great end the first chapter. The coup, the dead husband, the throne. The adventure is concluded. The prize is won, and we move on. But there is one more thing worth sitting with. One more layer. Because Catherine did not simply take power, she had to hold it. And holding power in Russia in 1762, as a foreign woman with no dynastic claim, and a husband whose death was obviously suspicious, required something more than courage. It required the same patient, architectural intelligence she had been deploying for 18 years. She understood immediately that there would be a reckoning with the question of legitimacy. She had no legal claim to the Russian throne. The closest legal heir was her own son Paul, 8 years old, conveniently young, and whose parentage was, to put it diplomatically, a matter of court speculation. She dealt with these threats not by eliminating the people involved, but by making herself so clearly, so competently, so obviously the best available option that the alternative seemed absurd. She worked with an intensity that astonished everyone around her. She was at her desk by 6 in the morning. She read every document herself. She knew the names of her governors, their deputies, the judges in her provincial courts. She wrote thousands of letters to foreign monarchs, to philosophers, to merchants, to military officers. Voltaire called her the greatest figure of the century. Frederick the Great of Prussia, the very man Peter III had humiliated Russia to please, began writing to her with a respect that bordered on infatuation. She managed her favourites with the same intelligence she brought to everything else. Grigory Orlov, who had helped put her on the throne, was for a time the most powerful man in Russia after her, but she never allowed that power to exceed hers. She was warm, she was generous, she was capable of genuine affection, but she never confused affection with authority, and she never let anyone else make that confusion on her behalf. She had learned this lesson by watching two things: the women who had loved Peter and been destroyed, and the men who had loved Empress Elizabeth and mistaken that love for power. She would be neither of those cautionary tales. She would, instead, be the one who wrote the cautionary tale for everyone else. There is a portrait of Catherine the Great painted in 1763, just a year after the coup. She's 34 years old in it, dressed in military uniform, seated on a white horse. She's looking directly at the viewer, not challenging, not performing, simply looking, as though she is perfectly comfortable, being seen. What you notice, if you look long enough, is the stillness in her face. This is not a woman who is afraid of what she has done or what it cost. This is a woman who has arrived precisely where she intended to arrive and is now assessing what needs to be done next. That stillness is the thing that defies easy categorization. We know how to understand conquerors who arrive with armies and noise and obvious force. We have stories for them, language for them, a whole grammar of historical drama built to accommodate them. Catherine arrived in silence. She arrived in a borrowed black dress, in a pre-dawn carriage, and she spoke to a regiment of soldiers in the early morning light, and by 7 in the morning it was done. She never raised her voice, she never lost control, she never made a single public gesture that could be called desperate. This is not the story of a woman who was lucky, or beautiful, or swept along by forces larger than herself. This is the story of a woman who at 14 years old began playing a very long and very dangerous game, who absorbed 18 years of humiliation and isolation and was never once distracted from the goal, and who on a single June morning executed something that should not have been possible, with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing for it her entire adult life. Peter III ruled Russia for 186 days. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as a footnote. Catherine the Great ruled for 34 years. She expanded Russia's territory by 200,000 square miles. She founded cities, reformed the legal code, corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment, and built institutions that would outlast her by centuries. They were married for 17 years. In all that time, he never once figured out who he was dealing with. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be recognized. Catherine the Great spent hers, making sure that by the time anyone recognized her, it was already far too late. Thank you for listening. If this story found you at the end of a long day, I hope it sent you to sleep thinking about the kind of patience that moves mountains, not loudly, not all at once, but in the dark, in silence, one quiet step at a time.